You know what would be absolutely hilarious, Isabella? Inviting your cleaner to the party, making her come in her uniform and everything. The one speaking was Fiona Andrews, holding a crystal glass of wine, her laughter already bubbling up before she even finished the sentence. Isabella Montgomery did not reply immediately, letting the silence do its heavy lifting as she gazed out the massive 4-meter window of her main living room. That window looked directly out onto the sprawling gardens of her Bel Air estate in Los Angeles, California, where Victoria Carter was currently scrubbing the marble patio on her hands and knees. Isabella smiled in that slow, sharp way her friends knew all too well, turning the wine glass between her perfectly manicured fingers. "You know what?" she finally said. "I think that is the best idea you have had in years." The three women laughed. Fiona, Lucy Parker, and Chloe Baker, all dressed immaculately, all wearing jewelry worth more than a lifetime of ordinary wages, gathering on a Tuesday afternoon to mock the world. Victoria Carter had spent 3 full years cleaning that colossal mansion, arriving promptly at 7 o'clock in the morning, donning the standard blue uniform with the Montgomery Estate logo, and vanishing into the corners of the house as if she were merely another piece of furniture. For 3 years she washed, scrubbed, ironed, and polished surfaces that never lost their shine simply because her tireless hands would not allow it. She had become entirely invisible to the wealthy family, and she was exceptionally good at it, perhaps far too good. "And how exactly are you going to pull this off?" asked Lucy, leaning forward with a malicious gleam in her eyes. Isabella stood up with that studied, effortless grace she always projected, as if the entire world were her personal runway, declaring that she would invite her formally, complete with a printed card. She walked across the grand room, down the white marble hallway lined with gold veins, turned left toward the interior gallery where the rhythmic sound of the mop could be heard, and appeared in the doorway. Victoria stood with her back turned, her dark hair pulled into a tight braid, moving with a quiet efficiency that had always inexplicably irritated Isabella. "Victoria," Isabella called out, and the young woman turned around without startling, her 28-year-old face possessing the honey-colored eyes of someone who had seen far, more than her age should allow. "Mrs. Montgomery, do you need something?" she asked respectfully. Isabella paused for theatrical effect, before announcing that she was hosting her birthday party on Saturday night, featuring 300 guests, a live orchestra, and French champagne. She pulled a small, cream-colored card with gold lettering from her blazer pocket and extended it forward, stating it was a formal invitation, adding a cruel reminder that it was a black tie event. Victoria looked at the card, then looked back at Isabella, and in a fraction of a second, something invisible to anyone not paying close attention shifted across her face. It was not surprise or confusion, but rather a profound recognition, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment to arrive for 3 long years. She calmly took the invitation, politely thanked her employer, and watched as Isabella turned away with a small, deeply satisfied smile to return to her anticipating friends. When Isabella reached the drawing room, announcing that the cleaner had accepted, the room erupted into vicious laughter. However, what none of the 4 women witnessed was what happened 10 seconds after Isabella left the gallery. Victoria Carter stood perfectly still, reading the name, the date, and the absurd address of her own workplace, reading every single word slowly, as if weighing them on a scale. She slipped the card into her blue uniform pocket, resumed mopping, and behind those unbreaking honey-colored eyes, a final, decisive chess piece slid perfectly into place. That evening, Victoria arrived at the tiny apartment she rented in East Los Angeles, a modest space with a polished concrete floor and a pot of basil by the window being its only luxury. She took off her uniform, took a long shower, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her cell phone in her hand. She dialed a number from memory, listening to the rings until a deep, commanding voice answered, carrying the unmistakable cadence of an old-money New York patriarch. "Grandfather," Victoria said softly into the receiver, "it is time." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by him asking if she was entirely sure about her decision, to which she gave a resolute confirmation. The older man exhaled deeply, his voice shifting away from alarm and settling into something far more serene and undeniably dangerous, stating they would begin preparations the very next morning. Victoria hung up, looked at the cream-colored card reflecting the dim light of her bedroom, and smiled a smile that was neither small nor timid, but rather the fierce expression of someone who had waited 3 years for this exact battle. The next morning, the Montgomery estate woke up as pristine and immaculate as always, with Victoria Carter arriving punctually at 7 o'clock, putting on her blue uniform and working with her usual quiet efficiency. Isabella ate breakfast on the sunlit terrace with her eldest son, Richard Montgomery, a 34-year-old man with dark hair, a strong jawline, and a commanding presence who had managed the family empire since his father passed away 5 years prior. "Important people are coming on Saturday," Isabella told him while spreading marmalade on her toast, reminding him to be charming to Isaac Gallagher, a powerful investor she desperately wanted him to court for a joint venture. Richard sighed heavily, setting his phone on the table with the exhausted patience he specifically reserved for his morning conversations with his mother. He promised he would be there, be polite, and secure the business deal before asking if there was anything else on her agenda. Isabella took a sip of her coffee and casually mentioned that she had invited Victoria, her cleaner, because she and the girls thought it would be a highly amusing spectacle. Richard stared at her with an indecipherable expression, quietly stating that he did not approve of the idea, only for Isabella to dismiss him, prompting him to walk away, leaving his coffee completely untouched. There are realities about poverty that wealthy people simply fail to comprehend, particularly the fact that a rare few choose it willingly because inherited money, when surrounded by the wrong people, can become the most expensive and invisible cage in the world. Victoria Vance knew this better than anyone else, for she had lived inside that gilded cage, slept on its silk sheets, and exactly 4 years ago had deliberately opened the door to walk out with her head held high. Escaping that universe without leaving a trace required erasing oneself entirely, and Victoria had proven to be exceptionally talented at becoming nobody. Arthur Vance was the kind of name that produced immediate physical reactions in anyone familiar with the highest echelons of the United States economy, causing jaws to tighten and postures to straighten involuntarily. He was a 73-year-old titan of industry with completely white hair, hands that had worked the earth before turning it to gold, and quiet, dark eyes that perceived far too much. He had raised his only granddaughter, Victoria, after her mother passed away from cancer when the girl was 16, teaching her that while her extravagant life did not define her, the difficult decisions she made certainly would. Victoria had learned those lessons so deeply that when she faced her first major adult heartbreak, she handled it with a clarity that left even her formidable grandfather speechless. At 24 years old, she had fallen deeply in love with Alexander Reed, a charming, socially intelligent man to whom she honestly revealed her true surname and the vast extent of her family's wealth. 6 months later, she discovered he had spent 3 of those months secretly meeting with aggressive investors, using her merely as a stepping stone to infiltrate her grandfather's corporate empire. Confronted with the truth, Alexander did not even bother to apologize, coldly explaining that she needed to understand how the real world operated. Victoria listened in silence, walked out to her car, cried for exactly 40 minutes, dried her eyes on the 41st, and made the most pivotal decision of her life. She told her grandfather she needed to disappear for a while, to live as someone else and understand the world without the protective umbrella of the Vance name, adopting her biological mother's maiden name, Carter, to start over in Los Angeles. The first 6 months were brutally difficult, teaching her that without her surname, people treated her with a completely different, often humiliating texture of silence, deciding she simply did not exist. However, amidst the shallow cruelty of the Montgomery household, she had observed Richard Montgomery working with a relentless, honest intensity, often arriving at 6 in the morning and leaving late at night. One Wednesday in December, while organizing the library, she overheard him aggressively defending a group of small suppliers on the phone, refusing to sign a legally sound but morally corrupt contract, which made her realize he was fundamentally different from his mother. Now, on Friday night, 24 hours before the grand party, Victoria sat across from her grandfather in a discreet luxury penthouse in downtown Los Angeles. Arthur Vance looked at his granddaughter from a dark leather armchair, his hands clasped, asking her how she felt about the impending storm. "I am completely calm," she replied, assuring him that nothing would go wrong, to which the old man smiled softly, noting that her mother would be incredibly proud of the woman she had become. At 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, as the California sun illuminated the sprawling city, 3 highly specialized individuals knocked on the door of Arthur Vance's penthouse with absolute military punctuality. Madame Céline Dupont, a legendary French stylist based in New York, arrived with 2 assistants and 4 professional luggage trunks, treating the morning not as a job, but as a critical surgical operation. Following her was Robert Sterling, the trusted family jeweler of 20 years, carrying a locked black leather briefcase containing items of unimaginable historical value, alongside Diana Foster, Arthur's personal assistant, holding a tablet with a meticulously detailed schedule. Victoria welcomed them in a simple robe, her damp hair falling over her shoulders, holding a mug of black coffee, radiating a quiet strength that made Madame Céline declare her bone structure extraordinary. While the women began their transformative work, Arthur Vance retreated to his private study, closing the heavy oak door to make 3 highly confidential phone calls to set the evening's trap in motion. The first 2 calls went to his elite legal team and the director of the Vance National Bank, verifying that specific documents and financial leverage points were perfectly aligned for the night's execution. The third call was dialed slowly, placed directly to the personal cell phone of Richard Montgomery, ringing 5 times before the young executive answered with the dry, gravelly texture of someone unaccustomed to unexpected morning interruptions. "Good morning, young man. I am Arthur Vance, and I assume you did not expect to hear from me today," the patriarch stated calmly. After a tense silence, Richard admitted he was not entirely surprised, prompting Arthur to reveal that his granddaughter, Victoria Vance, had been working in Richard's home for 3 years, and that a reckoning was coming that very night. "I know who she is," Richard finally confessed, his voice measured and careful, revealing that he had recognized her 3 weeks ago from an old financial magazine's archival photograph of the Vance estate. When Arthur pressed him on why he had kept silent, Richard explained it was not his place to expose her, as he first needed to understand what she was searching for in his home. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes briefly before stating that Richard now knew exactly what he had to do that evening, hanging up the phone without another word. In the master bedroom of the penthouse, the grand transformation was well underway, centered around a breathtaking dress that Madame Céline had spent 6 months designing, as if anticipating this exact historical moment. It was crafted from Milanese silk in a deep emerald green that shifted tones in the light, turning almost black in the shadows and glowing like a precious gemstone when struck directly. The fabric was covered in thousands of tiny, hand-stitched crystals applied by generations of artisan women, featuring a sweeping train measuring 1.5 meters that demanded absolute attention. Robert Sterling opened his secure briefcase on the dining table with the solemnity of a priest, revealing the legendary jewelry set Arthur had extracted from the deepest vault of the bank that morning. Resting on the navy blue velvet was her great-grandmother's diamond and emerald necklace, designed in the 1940s by a master jeweler in Florence, accompanied by matching earrings and a platinum ring that made its central stone appear to float. Victoria gently touched the cold, heavy diamonds with the tips of her fingers, acknowledging the weight of her family's legacy, ready to wear the armor she had abandoned 4 years ago. Barely 3 kilometers away at the sprawling Bel Air estate, the morning possessed an entirely different, chaotic energy, with 22 event staff members rushing to assemble the extravagant floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers. Isabella Montgomery supervised the chaos with a cup of herbal tea, dressed flawlessly, while her friends Fiona, Lucy, and Chloe arrived to revel in the anticipated humiliation of the poor cleaner they expected to show up in a ragged uniform. They giggled by the garden tables, completely oblivious to the fact that their target was currently being molded into an unstoppable force of nature in a downtown penthouse. By 2 in the afternoon, Madame Céline took a step back to admire her completed masterpiece, Having arranged Victoria's hair in soft, luminous waves pinned by a vintage diamond clasp, framing a face with deep wine-colored lips and piercing eyes. Arthur Vance entered the room, stopping completely in the doorway as he took in the sight of his granddaughter, radiating a power that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with ancient, undeniable bloodlines. Victoria looked at her own reflection, merging the woman who had scrubbed floors with the heiress of an empire, knowing she was finally complete and absolutely ready to descend upon the Bel Air estate. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the Montgomery mansion was the most brilliantly illuminated property in the entire neighborhood, projecting a golden glow through its massive windows that signaled extreme wealth. Luxury vehicles lined up systematically along the sweeping driveway, bringing 300 of the most powerful politicians, investors, and socialites in California to the grand entrance, managed by a flawless team of valets. These were individuals who moved entire industries with a single signature, viewing birthday parties not as mere celebrations, but as vital battlegrounds for asserting dominance and negotiating silent hierarchies. Isabella Montgomery stood in the grand foyer wearing an obscenely expensive white designer gown, dispensing calculated smiles and cheek kisses, remembering exactly which details to mention to flatter each arriving VIP. Her son, Richard Montgomery, stood far away by the mahogany bar, holding a glass of whiskey he had not sipped in 20 minutes, his eyes scanning the entering crowd with a tense, unreadable focus. He carried the heavy secret of Victoria's true identity in his chest. Feeling the profound responsibility of his morning conversation with Arthur Vance, waiting for the inevitable storm to breach the front doors. At 15 minutes past 9, Isabella gathered Fiona, Lucy, and Chloe near the base of the grand marble staircase, positioning themselves perfectly to intercept the cleaner the moment she awkwardly stepped inside. They whispered excitedly like schoolgirls, assuming Victoria's pride would force her to attend, eagerly anticipating the harsh contrast between her working-class reality and the sea of custom-tailored suits and diamond necklaces. Fiona pointed toward the driveway as a black luxury town car pulled up past the valet station, stopping directly at the main entrance, an anomaly that caused Isabella to frown in slight confusion. The uniformed chauffeur stepped out to open the rear door, extending a white-gloved hand to assist the passenger, and what emerged from the vehicle immediately paralyzed the onlookers gazing through the side windows. It was a tall, breathtakingly elegant woman wearing a dress that defied comprehension, moving with a fluid grace that commanded the space before anyone could even process her facial features. Fiona asked aloud who the mysterious guest was, while Isabella remained entirely silent, a cold, tiny knot of primal alarm beginning to twist in her stomach as her social instincts flared. The acoustics of the grand foyer usually absorbed the chatter of the crowd, but when Victoria stepped through the heavy double doors at 19 minutes past 9, a ripple of absolute silence spread like a stone dropped in a still pond. The emerald green silk caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, the train whispering softly against the white marble, while her great-grandmother's diamonds flashed with the historical brilliance of old money. The security men holding the guest lists forgot to check her name, and couples traversing the hallway stopped dead in their tracks, mesmerized by a presence that completely overshadowed the opulence of the house. Victoria moved smoothly toward the archway leading into the main ballroom, stepping directly into the path of Isabella Montgomery, who stared at the stunning apparition without immediate recognition. It took 3 full seconds for Isabella's brain to process the impossible data, the magnificent dress, the priceless jewels, the undeniable poise, before locking onto those familiar, unyielding honey-colored eyes. The realization hit Isabella like a physical blow, draining the blood from her face instantly, her body reacting to the catastrophic truth long before her conscious mind could form a coherent thought. "Good evening, Mrs. Montgomery," Victoria said in a perfectly modulated, warm voice that contained not a single trace of intimidation or malice. What a truly beautiful party. Isabella could not formulate a response, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, while Fiona, Lucy, and Chloe stared with identical expressions of profound cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile the majestic heiress before them with the invisible girl holding a mop. The surrounding guests had ceased their conversations, drawn by the magnetic pull of true beauty, leaving only the distant sound of the string quartet to fill the suffocating silence between the two women. Victoria held Isabella's terrified gaze for exactly the necessary amount of time before offering a polite, effortless nod, the kind executed only by those who have navigated high society since birth. She glided past the frozen hostesses into the heart of the ballroom, her emerald train sweeping past Fiona, who stood paralyzed with a champagne flute hovering near her lips. The 62-year-old head butler, who had ignored Victoria for 3 years, approached with a silver tray and bowed his head with profound, newly discovered reverence, acknowledging that the hierarchy of the house had irrevocably changed. Victoria spent 22 minutes circulating the grand ballroom, sipping champagne gracefully while observing the elite crowd with the tranquil recognition of someone who had once ruled this very world. Several powerful men gravitated toward her immediately, including Isaac Gallagher, the wealthy investor Isabella had been desperate to impress, who eagerly introduced himself with a mixture of calculated business interest and blatant admiration. Victoria responded to their inquiries with an elusive charm that revealed nothing, maintaining her absolute serenity while Isabella remained anchored near the entrance, her forced smile crumbling as she watched her cruel joke transform into an unmitigated disaster. Richard Montgomery had been slowly crossing the room since Victoria arrived, keeping a deliberate distance but never letting her out of his sight, his expression a mix of awe and heavy anticipation. From the shadows near the catering entrance, Diana Foster, Arthur Vance's hyper-efficient assistant, stepped forward and whispered into the ear of the veteran head butler for exactly 15 seconds. The butler nodded solemnly, understanding the immense gravity of the instruction, and walked to the exact center of the ballroom just as the orchestra finished their current waltz, commanding the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." The butler's voice projected flawlessly across the expansive space, causing the sea of guests to quiet down and turn toward him in a synchronized wave. Isabella frowned deeply from her spot by the archway, panicking because she had absolutely not authorized any formal announcements and had no idea how to stop what was already in motion. Representing the legendary Vance family of New York, and attending tonight by the special, personal invitation of Mrs. Isabella Montgomery, I present Miss Victoria Vance. The silence that followed those words lasted exactly 4 agonizing seconds as 300 elite guests simultaneously processed the sheer magnitude of the name that had just been spoken aloud. In the United States, the Vance family was not merely wealthy. They were a towering financial institution, representing a fortune with so many zeros that it induced an abstract, terrifying vertigo in anyone attempting to calculate it. Isaac Gallagher nearly dropped his crystal glass, a powerful senator choked on his drink, and the entire ballroom collectively pivoted their gaze toward the grand marble staircase where the announcement was directed. Victoria stood on the upper landing, having slipped up the familiar service stairs she used to scrub daily, perfectly timing her appearance with a logistical precision that bordered on the supernatural. She knew the texture of those 16 marble steps intimately, remembering the dark vein on the 3rd step and the tiny chip on the 9th, having polished them relentlessly with imported Italian soap. Now she prepared to descend them wearing a fortune in diamonds and emerald silk, looking down at the very people who had treated her as less than human for 36 months. As she placed her heel on the 1st step, she did not display an ounce of theatrical vengeance, but rather descended with the absolute, terrifying equanimity of a queen walking through her own palace. Isabella watched her glide downward, experiencing the brutal deconstruction of her entire reality. First came denial, then recognition, and finally a cold, suffocating terror. Isabella realized with devastating clarity that she had zero power, that she had never had any power, and that the woman she tried to humiliate had been holding the winning cards for 3 entire years. The 3 friends flanking Isabella completely lost their composure under the crushing weight of the revelation. Fiona gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her trembling mouth in a purely involuntary reaction of horror, while Lucy remained entirely frozen like a statue, her champagne suspended mid-air. Chloe Baker exhibited the most honest reaction of all, her face draining of color before flushing violently crimson, deeply ashamed as she fully comprehended the catastrophic magnitude of their shared cruelty. Victoria reached the final step and paused for a single breath in front of the four devastated women, her honey-colored eyes observing them without anger, only with a piercing, uncomfortable clarity. Before Isabella could stammer out a pathetic excuse, Arthur Vance entered the front doors with the slow, unquestionable authority of an emperor, causing the entire room's posture to straighten instinctively. Richard Montgomery broke away from the crowd, striding directly toward the patriarch to firmly shake his hand. Openly aligning himself with the truth, while looking at Victoria with an expression of profound, undeniable respect. Driven to a breaking point by the relentless humiliation of her shifting reality, Isabella finally cornered Victoria near a floral display, accusing her in a sharp, trembling voice of orchestrating a malicious, tasteless vengeance just to make her look foolish. Victoria looked at the older woman not with anger, but with a profound, unshakable calm, quietly reminding her that she had merely accepted an invitation that Isabella herself had offered as a weapon. Placing her champagne glass gently on a side table, Victoria stated that true class is neither gained nor lost in a single evening, but is painstakingly built or entirely destroyed through the thousands of small everyday choices made over 3 long years. Seeking a moment of quiet, Victoria stepped out onto the dimly lit garden terrace, only to be joined moments later by Richard, who stood before her without his usual corporate armor. He confessed, his voice thick with raw honesty, that he had known her secret for 3 weeks, but chose to stay silent because he wanted to see her handle the fire, admitting it was a selfish but deeply admiring choice. He told her that he had fallen for the woman who quietly read books in his library and showed kindness to the kitchen staff, emphasizing that her monumental wealth and intimidating surname meant absolutely nothing to his heart. Victoria studied him in the cool night air, acknowledging that she had overheard him defending innocent suppliers months ago, which was the first time she had struggled to remain an invisible ghost in his house. Shifting to the impending reality, she warned him about the corrupt financial ledgers she had uncovered during her years of cleaning, demanding they be rectified, to which Richard firmly agreed, asking only for one genuine opportunity to prove his worth to her. They shared a long, silent look under the stars, bridging the impossible gap between the billionaire heiress and the corporate son, understanding that their true story was only just beginning. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere had drastically cooled, and a defeated Isabella Montgomery was summoned to her own private library by Arthur Vance, who sat waiting in the shadows like a quiet judge. The 73-year-old Titan wasted no time on pleasantries, laying out 3 strict, non-negotiable conditions if the Montgomery family wished to survive the financial leverage he currently held over their entire corporate portfolio. She was ordered to correct the illegal ledgers, to deliver a sincere, private apology to Victoria in front of her inner circle the next morning, and to finally understand that her own arrogance, not Victoria's vengeance, had orchestrated her spectacular downfall. As the grand party slowly dissolved into the early hours of the morning, Isabella found Victoria standing alone in the grand foyer, her white designer dress now looking exhausted and severely wrinkled. Stripped of her vicious friends and her protective social armor, Isabella stopped 2 meters away, looked directly into the eyes of the woman whose floor she had demanded be scrubbed, and offered a simple, unadorned apology. Victoria accepted the 2 words quietly, recognizing the immense, painful effort it took for a woman like Isabella to finally shatter her own pride, offering a brief nod of genuine gratitude. Before stepping out into the cool California night, Victoria turned back to Isabella, adding a gentle but firm request that fundamentally demonstrated the depth of her character. She asked Isabella to protect the employment of Mr. Henderson, the 70-year-old gardener, and Sarah from the catering staff, revealing that she knew they were struggling to pay for their spouses' medical bills. Isabella blinked, stunned by the heiress's lingering concern for the invisible workers of the estate, and solemnly nodded her agreement, finally grasping the monumental difference between possessing mere wealth and possessing true nobility. 3 weeks later, bathed in the morning sunlight of her grandfather's penthouse, Victoria Vance signed a massive logistics contract with Isaac Gallagher, legally cementing protections for working-class suppliers that the ruthless investor dared not question. That very afternoon, she received a brief text message from Richard Montgomery confirming that the corrupted ledgers had been thoroughly purged and completely rectified, a promise kept by a man determined to be worthy of her respect. She saved his number with a soft smile, knowing that her turbulent journey through the shadows of the working class had not only forged her own unyielding strength, but had also salvaged the soul of the man she was coming to love. Life has a profound way of teaching us that true wealth is never measured by the weight of gold, the vastness of a bank account, or the grand illusion of an elite surname, but rather by the quiet dignity we uphold when the world strips us of our privileges. We often rush to judge the worth of a person based on the uniform they wear or the invisible labor they perform, forgetting that the most resilient character is forged in the silent shadows of humility, step by step, tier by tier. Patience is not merely the ability to wait, but the strength to maintain our core values while enduring the cruelty of those who confuse arrogance with superiority. As we navigate the complex autumn of our lives, we realize that the deepest form of class cannot be bought in luxury boutiques. It is woven into the compassion we show to those who can do nothing for us. Ultimately, revenge is a hollow victory, but standing fiercely in the light of our own hard-earned truth, while leaving the door open for others to find their redemption, is the ultimate manifestation of a life truly and beautifully lived.